Welcome to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors on the Artist First Radio Network. All past broadcasts are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host, Pastor S.J. Munson, is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of Christianity. Find them wherever great books are sold. Now, here he is, your host, Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. Last month here in the U.S., a presidential administration was inaugurated that now threatens the very fabric of our democracy and rule of law. How did this happen? And how did we get here? And what's more, what can we do to push back against the forces of greed and authoritarianism that threaten to undo us? Tonight, we are very fortunate to have author and investigative journalist Katherine Stewart. She's the author of the best-selling The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, which formed the basis of the recent Rob Reiner documentary, God and Country, released last year. And her most recent book, which is due for release, is Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, The Guardian, and she has appeared on news programs such as MSNBC, CNN, and NPR. Katherine Stewart, welcome, and thank you for making time for us.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Now, in your previous book, The Power Worshippers, you trace the development of Christian nationalism and the pivotal role it has played in bringing about this crisis. Can you talk about that book and maybe encapsulate some of your findings for us? And for starters, for example, what is Christian nationalism, just for the sake of those who may not be familiar with the term?
Sure. Those are great questions. You know, the term Christian nationalism is descriptive of an ideology as well as a political movement engaged in an organized quest for power. So it's not just describing people who are Christian and have patriotic sentiments. It's not a religion. It's not a set of beliefs. It really involves a rejection of a series of liberal democratic norms, including equality, democratic elections, pluralism, and the separation of church and state. It involves the embrace of a more authoritarian form of politics in which a dominant religion or approved set of religions or culture use the power of government to impose an allegedly moral vision of society on everybody else. So it involves identitarian politics that sort of ground the legitimacy of the political order on a group that perceives itself to be the true representatives of the national identity. So it's a kind of reactionary nationalism. It's this idea of who gets to properly belong in the country and who doesn't. So that's the ideology, the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation, as they define Christianity, and our laws should be based on sort of their approved interpretations of the Bible. But when we're talking about the Christian nationalist movement, this is a leadership-driven movement. It's organization-driven as well, and its power rests on a deep organizational infrastructure. It includes a lot of organizations we can divide into categories. There are policy groups and think tanks. There's a vast legal advocacy ecosystem, networking organizations that get members of the leadership of the movement on the same page. There are pastoral networks that get sort of very political pastors together, and movement leaders come together and tell them that they need to get them to turn their congregations to vote for, quote, biblical values. But the biblical values they choose are inevitably these sort of like shiny baubles of the culture wars, rather than the principle of empathy or caring for the least of these or working toward a common good. And then, of course, the movement includes, I would say, an information sphere or disinformation sphere that reaches the rank and file. And, that it's that deep organizational infrastructure that I focused on in Power Worshippers. But Christian nationalism or religious nationalism is really only one feature of the anti-democratic movement overall. there are others as well. So, I really sort of, as I was researching this movement, I honestly, I just saw so much more. Like when you go to a diverse conference of pastors in Virginia, I'll just give you an example. This is something I talk about in chapter 1 of Money, Lies, and God. And all of a sudden, you're in this sort of very religious space, and you've got these pastors gathering together, and you've got leaders of the movement who've like flown there to give a presentation to these pastors and get them to turn out their congregations to vote for biblical values. But all of a sudden, they start talking about election fraud, and they're promoting lies about a stolen election that have been debunked by Republican teams of operatives in Arizona, but they still are sort of pumping up these lies. And then you realize the whole operation is being funded by a California billionaire. You start to think that the story doesn't really fit within a simple frame about, say, white evangelicals or a demographic change. So, as I kept researching the movement, I realized the topic was bigger than I had imagined. And Money, Lies, and God has really emerged out of my reporting on the movement.
So as you were writing the previous book, Power Worshippers, the seeds of the next book were already there, and you saw this is going to take more reporting and research.
Absolutely. I came to see we can't talk about Christian nationalist ideology without investigating the role it plays in the larger political economy. It really started to look like one part of this bigger story, and that's how my focus shifted. And I was researching not just the domestic side, but also the international side of religious nationalism. And I came to the view that this is not nearly as uniquely American as some of the narratives say that it is or suggest that it is. There are a lot of, key differences within the movement now than there was, say, even 20 years ago. It's broadened its base of donors substantially. It's increased its power. It's making new inroads into new populations. It's bringing in different forms of religion to give the movement new energy overall. We can talk about that later with the rise of sort of bringing I would say independent charismatic networks into the movement. It's more overt in calling for an end to democracy. Movement leaders used to feel that they had to hide their belief that only Christians of certain reactionary varieties should dominate the key features of government and society. And now they're frankly pretty open about it. The way I do my research is I attend a lot of right-wing and Christian nationalist gatherings. And at some of these conferences I've attended, speakers basically sneer at Christians who emphasize Jesus' teachings of social justice, dismissing them as woke heretics and false prophets and even agents of Satan.
Now, you say in your introduction to the new book, Money, Lies, and God, you say, let me quote here, "The big story of our time is the rise of an anti-democratic political movement in the U.S. Like any such movement, this one is diverse and complicated. It brings together a collection of people and ideas that in ordinary circumstances would not dream of sharing a bed." Then you list what you call a rowdy mix of personalities. For example, I'll just read a few. So-called apostles of Jesus, atheistic billionaires, reactionary Catholic theologians, women haters, high-powered evangelical networkers, Jewish devotees of Ayn Rand, and so on and so forth. It sort of looks like a Dick Tracy lineup, And, what unites all these groups? Or perhaps a better question is, who has united these groups, and how do such disparate groups with such different motivations and goals manage to stay together?
We can say they're rowing in the same boat, as it were, or they're all sort of swimming in the same headwaters, but their aims are often at cross purposes. I would say the most obvious one is the difference between the agenda of the funders of the movement, who want lower taxes for the rich, deregulatory environments for their businesses, along with subsidies and protective policies for sort of their monopolistic businesses. So they basically want to increase their wealth, and often at the expense of others, and at the expense of the rank and file. So they want one thing, but the rank and file, who I would say largely occupy the sort of middle and lower rungs of the economic spectrum, or the working and middle classes, they really want a better deal for themselves and for the workforce. And yet the funders are pouring money into organizations that are eroding rights for the workforce, trying to break unions, trying to destroy public schools, which many, if not most, of the rank and file depend upon, increasing wealth at the tippy top of the economic spectrum, which frankly makes it harder for members of the rank and file to have dignified lives. This is a movement that claims to stand for family values, and it sort of recruits a lot of rank and file members to their cause by purportedly supporting these family values, but it's promoting support for politicians whose policies are actually making it so much harder for average American families to succeed.
Now, I'm going to brag about you a little bit to our listeners, and I hope I won't embarrass you, but you are a very good writer, and I'm sure you know that by now. But you're also a good story.
Honored by praise.
You're a good storyteller, and not every good writer is a good storyteller. And I do a lot of reading. I'm reading a couple of biographies, these massive tomes right now, and they're written by very good writers who, like you, do meticulous research, but they're also kind of boring. And yours, I couldn't put it down, I have to say. And I think part of the charm and the attraction of your book is that you experienced so many of these things, so much of your research firsthand. You lived this. You went to big rallies, as you talked about. You went to conferences, and you went to mega churches, and even little meetings in people's living rooms. And you met these people. You met the foot soldiers in the movement. You met some of the leaders. And so talk about that experience, what it was like to research all this and go to all these events, and maybe pick out one or two experiences in particular that really stand out to you or made an impact on you the most.
Oh, thank you. I mean, sometimes as a reporter, it's the small, seemingly irrelevant side conversations that give you the most insight, that sort of hit the hardest, right? So, offhand, I can think of a woman I met at a Texas church that was affiliated with the New Apostolic Reformation, which is an independent, charismatic network. She was this lovely woman, single mom of 3. Her life, she was very, very kind person, but life had not been particularly kind to her in return. And, she comes to church, she's got her kids in her arms, and they're sort of whisked away and taken to another area of the building where they receive, children's education and Bible study. And I could really see why she loved this church. I mean, frankly, I loved it too. Great community, incredible worship music. People could dance. They could sort of talk with one another about life's deeper meanings. It wasn't at all snobby, it was very sort of accepting of who you are, where you are in your life. And it was a real chance to let loose after a really challenging week, a kind of moment of real kind of uplift, right? Mm-hmm. But amidst all of this sort of wonderful stuff, that this church was engaged in sort of pushing its people to engage in kind of hard right politics. And there was a real, if you look at, if you're getting these people and you're telling them that they need to, vote a certain way, they're going to be voting for politicians who are going to make life harder for them and not easier. The policies that it was driving toward include the sort of defunding and weakening and eventual closure perhaps of public schools. Now, this woman had a child with disabilities. and was obtaining services at her local public school, because this is what public schools are bound by law to do. You have to provide services to kids who need extra help. And if this is a movement that wants to essentially shutter public schools, or transfer public money over to private schools that can reject kids with disabilities, or charters that don't have to accept kids with disabilities. Is that really going to help this woman? The politicians, the sort of hard right politicians, are aimed at the disempowerment of the workforce. They're on the side of the sort of corporate overlords who are funding the movement and them. They're pushing for policies that will allow employers to discriminate against people like her, or sideline her in her job searches, et cetera. So I just think, well, is her life ultimately going to be better if this church and many others like it engage in the kind of sort of political activism that they're engaging in? So it was a real disconnect. I mean, I can think of another sort of side conversation that comes to mind. Took place at a Moms for Liberty breakfast. I met this woman who'd been sort of involved in a kind of haphazard way in the anti-abortion movement in the past. But then, she's following social media. She's, getting her news from Telegram, et cetera. And she hears that a book written by Anne Frank, it's called The Diary of a Young Girl. She hears that it's in her public school library, and it was the discovery of this book that put her over the top. So I asked her, well, what did she find objectionable about The Diary of a Young Girl? And which was a book about, a sort of autobiographical book about this young teenager who was hidden in, during the Holocaust until she was eventually, and eventually she died in one of the camps. And what she said to me amazingly was the lesbian scene. Oh, I read Anne Frank's book, like many of us when I was young, and I struggled to remember a lesbian scene in the book. Well, you know what? There isn't one, right? But the moral story of the story is that a lot of people come from, there was one scene where Anne sort of expresses some adolescent curiosity with her friend, and this is just, teenagers do stuff like this, but it was like a very brief passage, and it was not a lesbian scene, okay? Mm-hmm. But, a lot of the people like this lady come from frankly uninformed backgrounds, or they have these sort of idiosyncratic takes on this material. And the views are often really quite offensive. Like if you dug into it, you might find some unexamined anti-Semitism or unexamined homophobia. But it's really kind of disconnected from reality. So, here's a woman whose response to a moving testimonial about the Holocaust is some utterly tangential obsession with the culture war issues that happen to be dominating America's school boards. This movement is really good at tapping into and exploiting these kinds of unthinking prejudices and turning these, these things that amount to less than a molehill into these mountains.
Now you talk in your book about when exactly this crisis began, and you say the particular note, the anti-democratic reaction draws much of its energy from the massive increases in economic inequality and resulting economic dislocations over the past 5 decades. So, in other words, I guess all of this may be the direct result of what they call neoliberal economic policies over the past 50 years. Can you explain what has happened and why?
The money piece is one piece of it. It's not the only piece, but it's really central for 2 reasons, I would say. One is that it's driving a lot of the actual policy agenda. So when we hear about the so-called deconstruction of the administrative state, stuff that we're actually seeing play out in the current Trump administration before our eyes, thanks to Musk's efforts, this is mainly a project by and for the plutocrats. Now, it can be given a kind of Christian nationalist window dressing, They might often say, this is what God wants. This is God's, there was too much, satanic wokeness or whatever in the federal government. And look, the federal government, like the private sector, can always there's always room for improvement. But what they're doing is like destroying rational policymaking. And this mainly serves the interests or the perceived interests of an economic elite. I mean, the other factor is that managing the anti-democratic apparatus isn't cheap. You essentially need a welfare system to sustain a cadre of shock troops, the same ones who, by the way, are now taking up positions in what appears to be a spoils system that Trump is creating. You need to be able to fund $100 million and more campaigns for the courts, campaigns for Supreme Court appointees, and misinformation operations. And all of this costs something to create and maintain. So in Money, Lies, and God, I do pay very close attention to the group of people I call the funders. I'm thinking just, for example, of people like the Corkeries or Barry Side or Bradley Foundation. There are a lot of family foundations involved, or the Wilkes Brothers or Tim Dunn. The funders are not any one type, frankly. Some are Catholic, some are evangelical, some are Jewish, others are atheistic. Religiously, they're all over the place. But they are agreeing on one thing, which is the need to crush liberals, right? And what they call the administrative state. So, not surprisingly, on the whole, they want policies that privilege them. There's sort of these kind of extreme libertarian policies that would remove any restrictions on their money-making operations, but at the same time, getting sometimes tax privileges, sometimes privileged contracts and things like that. I'm just to round that out, I just want to say that these inequalities, this sort of massive sort of upward shift of wealth to the tippy top of the economic ladder is making life more difficult for the rank and file. That makes people anxious. And when you have these kinds of anxieties, they can be easily tapped into. The movement leaders want to say, well, don't blame, don't look at economic inequality issues in our country. Don't look at like the fact that 11.4 million children live in poverty. That's 16% of children in America. Don't look at that. Look at this issue over here with sports and trans people, or look at this thing over here with, thing that they're, teaching CRT in public schools, which by the way, they're not. But you get people anxious about those things, and they'll blame those things on their problems rather than looking at some of the real factors that are making lives more difficult for them.
One of the more scary things that you talk about in the book is something that you call reactionary nihilism. And let me quote, this movement represents a serious threat to the survival of American democracy. It isn't looking for a seat at the noisy table of American democracy. It wants to burn down the house. What do you mean by reactionary nihilism, and why do they want to burn down the house?
I think of nihilism as a description of those whose fundamental aim is to destroy rather than to create, and who deny that there's any real truth or value in the world, right? And by reactionary, I mean that, rather than advance or progress toward a better state, this movement emphasizes a return to some imaginary version of an allegedly better past. A past that includes elements of a regressive social order, like gender hierarchy, like the suppression of certain forms of speech, attacks on religious freedom of those who fail to conform, among other features. I mean, just, as an aside, I was listening earlier today to a Doug Wilson video. You know who he is, right? He's a sort of very political pastor from Moscow, Idaho, who is talking, and he's Pete Hegseth's, head of the sort of parachurch network that Pete Hegseth attends one of their churches or has attended in the past. Well, he was actually giving a speech where he was talking about how the right to vote for women was a mistake. Like, really? Is that when things were better? Better for whom? So I put those words together, reactionary nihilism, to describe the anti-democratic reaction. Now, to be sure, there are times when we all want to go back to the good old days, and not everybody who does that or says that is a nihilist. Like, sometimes, we all long for whatever elements that, we can recall being better or imagine were better. But the ones who believe the democratic political system and its ideals are so flawed and so bad that they need to be totally destroyed, just smash the whole system up. And at the same time, they're exalting a completely fictitious and unrealistic fantasy about the golden age of yore. I think of these people as reactionary nihilists. Their vision is not based on reality. It's a retreat into a fantasy that's projected onto the past.
Another thing I found refreshing in your book is that, unlike a lot of authors and journalists, you seem to be comfortable using the word fascism when you're describing this crisis. Many journalists are still shy about using that word, even after all we're seeing right now. Why have you chosen to use that word? And then you say toward the end of the book, but the descent into fascism remains the most likely path through which the American experiment ends, if it is to end. Are we in a fascist regime right now?
Well, I actually think it's not quite right to say that I have no trouble using that word. I actually use a lot of different words to describe the crisis we're facing, depending on the context. As a writer, I try to be sensitive to nuance, and I'll use it sometimes depending on the words and framing around the word. Authoritarianism or the anti-democratic reaction is, I think, better understood as something that happens to a political system rather than something that starts off as a full-fledged political program that receives majority support. So when I suggest that the anti-democratic movement is more pathology than program, what I mean is that it has a number of different pieces, different sectors, sometimes working together, sometimes working for different aims, but that they nevertheless end up reinforcing one another. So, I think that it's important to note that the collective action can be unpredictable and can frankly lead to consequences that many of the rank and file who are lending their support to this movement don't anticipate and they don't want. So not everyone who voted for the current president, for instance, could be described as a Christian nationalist or hostile to democracy or a fascist or anything like that. But, by sort of lending support to the movement, which brought him to power, they're basically lending support to an authoritarian agenda.
Thank you for clarifying that. Now, another thing that you point out is that really most of us Americans have no idea how deep things go and how well funded it is. You say that the matrix is far more densely connected, well financed, and influential at all levels of government and society than most Americans appreciate. And then you talk about how these things are happening not just here but in other countries as well, and that this is not the result of just similar socioeconomic situations, but also it's there on purpose. It's there purposefully planted, funded, and so forth. Can you name some of the countries and groups that you're talking about, and how deeply, for example, is say Russia behind a lot of what we're experiencing now, and who are some of the other very key players?
Yeah, I would say this movement is frankly being exported aggressively around the world, but at the same time, it's also drawing on resources and alliances from overseas. So the technology transfer goes in both directions. I think many nations have some version of their own parallel but different movements that are hostile to democracy and liberalism, but these different kinds of parties and activists in different countries are increasingly finding ways to work together across borders. Yes, I mean, in a way, we have role models in Hungary and Russia. Russia certainly is a good Christian country by its own reckoning, but it is best described, frankly, as a corrupt, kleptocratic oligarchy with a sort of sad economy. And that's the direction in which the, I would call it now the Trump-Musk administration for the time being is taking us. And whether we go there really depends on whether we have the collective will to fight for a better future. I mean, religious nationalist countries are often theocratic in a certain fake sense. And by the way, this is not remotely limited to Christianity. Let's think about Erdogan in Turkey. Let's think about the leaders in Iran who bind themselves tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own country and establish a kind of, official form of religion and make sure that, everybody sort of adheres to whatever the morality police tells them they have to do. So it's sort of, they endorse a particular religion, they attempt to impose that religion on society. But these countries are more often best described as cronyistic kleptocracies with strong militaristic features and absolute suppression of free speech and suppression of political opposition.
You point out that one of the most complex and self-contradicting aspects of this movement is that it's actually at war with itself. And you say, quote, as it wages war on the rest of us, it consists of a variety of groups and organizations, each pursuing its own agendas, each in thrall to a distinct set of assumptions. Viewed as a whole, it seems to want things that cannot go together. Can you lead us through that?
Sure. I mean, the movement claims to want small government, but it wants a government big enough to control the most private acts in which people engage and affect and influence control their most private decisions that affect and impactful decisions. It wants deregulation of corporate monopolies and other policies that benefit the funders, but it also lays claim to a kind of faux populism. They say they want rule of law, but they're also greenlighting lawlessness at the very top of our government by replacing top brass at the FBI and the DOJ with loyalists who are going to allow our president and his cronies to pilfer the public treasury. They say they want a Christian nation, but what they mean by that actually excludes, I would say, many, if not most American Christians from the ranks of the supposedly righteous. Most Christians, I think, understand the faith as having something to do with the social gospel. But, I recently attended a Christian nationalist event where the social gospel was called heretical. So these are some of the contradictions. You talk about the different groupings of people and admit that the categories that you put them in may be a little simplistic, but you name 5 main categories: the funders, which we've talked a little bit about, thinkers, people like from think tanks, conservative think tanks, and so forth, sergeants, infantry, and power players. I don't want you to have to outline all of those because I want people to read the book. I don't want to give it all away. But could you talk about a few of those things and give some examples? Sure, absolutely. I shine a spotlight on a movement called the New Right, and technically the intellectuals on the New Right, who I call the thinkers, aren't quite what you'd call Christian nationalists, although some, like Russell Vought, identifies as a Christian nationalist, but many others don't. Or maybe they do in a certain performative way. I mean, many of them actually draw inspiration from political theorists associated with the Nazis. Others have this idea that, there's a kind of language that you speak when you're talking to the little people, the rank and file, but another kind of language that you reserve for your inner circle, when you're talking about what you're really after. I think a lot of them just worship nothing more than power, but they have played a crucial role in bringing together funders with the foot soldiers of the Christian nationalist movement. I mean, the foot soldiers, I would say, this rank and file has to be distinguished from the leaders of political pastors and national activists cohorts that I call the sergeants and power players. And they're the ones setting the agenda. This is a leadership-driven movement. The agenda is really not being set by the rank and file.
I have to say, reading this book did cause me some sleepless nights, but it also gave me some hope. I mean, you tell it like it is, but you also, give us some hope. When I was, let me backtrack a little bit. When I was reading the book and reading about how complex this movement is, with all these different competing parts, it actually gave me maybe some false hope. I thought, well, maybe this will all collapse of its own weight, or they'll be too busy fighting each other to do much damage. But you warn us that may be wishful thinking at this point. Is that right?
Well, there's definitely damage. We're seeing it play out before our eyes. And I won't get into all the kinds of damage that are taking place because, it's just so sad. This is not the idea of America that some of our most important thinkers, people like Thomas Jefferson and Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, had in mind. But I think, the end section of the book, I really do get into some of the recommendations for how we can meet the challenge. I mean, I don't have time to get into all of them in detail, but I think there are a couple things that should give us a sense that there is, if there's will to turn this around, it can be done. First of all, there are more of us than them. That is, results of the election notwithstanding, there are more Americans who would prefer to live in a democracy and sort of continue to, enjoy the freedoms that we have rather than live in a kleptocratic, nepotistic autocracy where, again, there's a kind of feeding frenzy at the very top of the economic spectrum, and there's no accountability for a more dictatorial type of leader and his inner circle. Like, I just don't think that that's going to enhance the national well-being or wealth. And I think if more Americans understood what was happening, they would not support it. Second of all, I think, organization really matters. The movement represents a minority of the population, but they punch above their political weight precisely because they're so organized, because they invest in things like leadership, development, because they, invest in people who then know they can sort of secure their economic futures and their careers within this movement. And I think that, getting involved in different organizations is super important. I remember one time Ralph Reed was at some gathering and he said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he's right. The movement only punches above its political weight because it has this, the infrastructure of the movement functions as a giant get out the vote machine. They turn out their people in election cycles. If you look at this last election, Donald Trump didn't win by a huge margin, especially compared with other presidents. He actually won by a relatively small margin, smaller margin than that which Biden won by in 2020. But there was depressed enthusiasm for the voting on the Democratic side. We won't get into the reasons for that. I think some of them are clear to people. But, voting really matters. And it's not just your own vote, although that really sincerely matters. It's important to vote in every election, not just national elections. It's important to get your people out to vote, but, hold people accountable to it. But there are things we can, certain things we can do by ourselves, voting, getting your circle together, getting involved in local politics, which is super important. But also there are things we can only do when we join together with others. There are no shortage of pro-democracy organizations out there. And when you join with others who are engaged in a kind of struggle to shore up our democratic principles and work to actually improve our country and create a more perfect union, that's where you find the hope.
We've been talking to author and journalist Katherine Stewart, who's the author of her new book, Money, Lies, and God Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Katherine, thank you so much for spending time with us, and thank you so much for all that you've said and your encouragement. I really wish you well with this new book. It's available on Amazon, I'm assuming, as well as wherever good books are sold.
That's right. And you can also follow me on Blue Sky. It's Katherine.Stewart at Blue Sky. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you all for tuning in. This is S.J. Munson signing off.